Global Voices on Taiwan. Hi everyone, welcome back to Global Voices on Taiwan. I'm Rath Wang, a news producer and host. Subbing in for Vincent today is Yiting.
Hello, I'm Eating from Lighting's campaign office. Today, we will be exploring with you how the latest world events impact Taiwan and how this island nation shakes the globe. We hope the podcast can be your window to Taiwan's global perspectives.
Joining us today from Tokyo is Stephen Nagy, fellow at the Japan Institute for International Affairs and the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. Professor Nagy also teaches politics and international affairs at Japan's International Christian University. He's just one of the many experts, journalists, and policymakers on our podcast. One watershed moment we've recently seen is a joint statement in support of Taiwan at Camp David. Japan's Prime Minister Kishida, South Korea's President Yoon, and U.S. President Biden publicly said, quote, "Peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait is indispensable to the security and prosperity of the international community." How significant is this statement, Professor?
I think when we think about the joint statement at the Camp David summit between the South Koreans, the Japanese, and the United States on Taiwan, it's a reflection of the importance that Taiwan fills within the sea lines of communication. About 5.5 trillion US dollars of trade go through the South China Sea and in and around the Taiwan Strait, which means that if there was a military conflict or some kind of accidental conflict in and around these straits, it would fundamentally disrupt global trade and the flow of energy exports into the second largest economy, the third largest economy, and the 10th largest economy, South Korea. So it's really critical that this region and the waters in and around Taiwan remain stable, they remain peaceful, and they remain regulated by international law.
Do you feel that we'll see more of these statements coming, as we've seen countries from in NATO and outside of NATO talk about Taiwan and about peace in the Taiwan Straits?
Absolutely, and I think that we started to see these statements when the late Prime Minister Shinzo Abe stepped down from his premiership, and then we saw his predecessor, Prime Minister Suga, visit Washington and the summit with President Biden, and they included a statement about peace and stability across the Taiwan Straits. Since that time, we've seen Taiwan be front and center of a NATO statement, of a G7 statement. We've seen the Quad summit also talk about the importance of Taiwan. And most recently, and I think surprisingly, is South Korea has unilaterally talked about the importance of peace and stability across the Taiwan Straits. And as you mentioned, the Camp David summit reiterated the importance that Taiwan is in terms of the region's broader economic stability, but really thinking about what happens in Taiwan matters to not only the region, but the global economy. And I think this is why we're continuing to see more of Taiwan in international and multilateral statements, because there's a recognition that the current actions by Beijing to whether it's military exercises or its threats across the Taiwan Straits really could be an extremely disruptive force on the global economy.
Touching further on this milestone, what has brought Japan and South Korea together, despite so much animosity towards their historical grievances and disagreements?
Well, I think it's important for us to recognize that South Korea and Japan and their citizens, they generally like each other. But on issues of history, there are some serious challenges. And of course, our South Korean friends still are seeking some financial compensation for forced labor by the Japanese during its imperial period. And there's also discussions about the comfort limit issue and how this could be dealt with in a more adept way by the Japanese. But that being said, I think under President Yoon's leadership, he has understood the importance of the bilateral relationship between Japan and South Korea, understands the importance of strengthening the trilateral relationships with the United States as well. And they have converged in terms of their concerns about China's assertive behavior in the region broadly, but some of its track record of economic coercion And of course, South Korea experienced economic coercion in 2017 after the release of the treated water from Fukushima. We've seen bullying, economic coercion, even racialized abuse against the Japanese following the release of the treated water from Fukushima. So these countries are understanding that their neighbor is an important economic opportunity, but its assertive behavior, its efforts to revise the regional security structure, and its behavior towards Taiwan are fundamentally destabilizing and not in the interests of Japan or South Korea, pushing them together rather than driving them apart.
So you probably agree that it is China's aggression bringing like-minded democracies together in a way that we've never seen before, right? Is this reassuring for Taiwan, given that it abides with the international rules-based order?
I think importantly, it's not just democracies that are concerned about this assertive behavior. Vietnam, um, Malaysia, the Philippines, Indonesia are also concerned about Chinese behavior. And I think that we see other countries outside the region also looking at Chinese assertive behavior within the region as fundamentally destabilizing, fundamentally against the rules-based order that has brought peace and stability and prosperity since um, the end of World War II. And again, they're looking at Taiwan and seeing it really as a canary in the coal mine. If something happens to Taiwan, what will be the fundamental consequences, the cascade of negative effects on the broader region? And I think in this sense, Taiwan has become an important part of many countries' foreign policy and how they think about the Indo-Pacific region.
Professor, you mentioned earlier the economic significance of Taiwan. We've seen Japan and Taiwan boost economic ties, and TSMC is on its way to build a second semiconductor fab in Japan, while its first is almost operating and running. How significant is Taiwan to Japan's economy?
As Japan thinks about Taiwan, it's thinking about its position with the sea lines of communication that I mentioned earlier. In that if there was a kinetic conflict, that's a military conflict or some kind of accidental conflict in the straits or in and around Taiwan, it would disrupt sea lines of communication and the import of export of goods into Japan, not to mention energy resources. So Taiwan has a really, really important part of the Japanese economy. Second, of course, is this technology and the complementariness of many aspects of the Taiwanese economy with the Japanese economy. Japan worries about, again, what could potentially happen if there was a forced reunification, what that would mean for products such as semiconductors that are produced by the Taiwanese semiconductor manufacturing company. Would they be disrupted? Would they be weaponized? Would they be monopolized by the Chinese government, fundamentally affecting the signature industries of Japan? Remember, Toyota, Suzuki, Honda, many of the parts that go into phones and computers and other electronics do have these semiconductors that are made in Taiwan, but in Japanese products. So there's a real view that if something were to happen to Taiwan, it would fundamentally affect the Japanese economy in a negative way. And lastly, Japan has very, very close people-to-people relations, historical relations, and cultural relations with the Taiwanese people, which they value, they want to protect, and they want to maintain moving forward.
Going back to the economy, Japan and even the Netherlands, there might have been sort of a bit of long discussions with the US in terms of de-risking, but we've seen that happen. Do you feel with this trend led by the US, will Taiwan play a greater role in the context of Japan or even North America with Canada or even the EU?
Well, the broader trend, Raf, is that countries, again, are recognizing that Taiwan is a really, really important part of the stability and peace across the region, and what happens to Taiwan matters. They also see Taiwan as a global public good, and what I mean by that is that Taiwan is not only producing those critical semiconductors that many countries rely on for their vanguard technologies, but how Taiwan manages its democracy, how it manages its bilateral relations with China, how it manages its future is in the interest of I think, countries around the world. And as a result, what we're seeing is countries finding creative ways to engage with Taiwan. So a good example of this in the new Canadian Indo-Pacific strategy, Canadians advocate for environmental cooperation and indigenous cooperation between Australia, New Zealand, Taiwan, and Canada. And we're seeing, of course, Japan, the Netherlands, South Korea, and the United States talk about semiconductor cooperation. So I think the broader trend is that we're seeing cooperation with Taiwan in the areas of business, trade, economy, dealing with environmental issues, indigenous issues. Moving forward, I assume that we'll have health issues as well, to try to build a series of multilateral relationships that really embed Taiwan in the international community, but in a nuanced way that doesn't bring on more aggression from Beijing.
Going back a little bit to politics and also people to people linkages, we've seen the US LDP delegation recently visited Taiwan and they met with President Tsai and different political parties here as well. There have been similar meetings between the ruling parties of both countries and also a high profile visit by former Prime Minister Taro Aso. Some have said that the number and frequency is unprecedented. This is something you mentioned before, but I would love to hear a little bit more about this from you.
I think that the LDP, the Liberal Democratic Party in Japan, is trying to create those strong party to party relations with the Taiwanese leadership to communicate their concerns about what's happening in the region, to find opportunities to problem solve within the region, to get a better sense of the direction of Taiwanese politics. In some ways, it mirrors the former party to party relationships that existed between the LDP and the CCP, Chinese Communist Party, in that they use these informal pipelines for problem solving with the Chinese relationship. Now, what we've seen in the China context is that the party to party relationships have really deteriorated tremendously. And this has resulted in many communication challenges and more challenges in terms of dealing with the bilateral relationships between Beijing and Tokyo. But with regards to Taiwan and Japan, again, the LDP sees the importance of having party-to-party communications. It kind of bypasses the concerns about state-to-state relations because it's party-to-party. And again, they want to build these strong lines of communication, shared understandings of the region, focus on peace and stability across the Taiwan Straits to really ensure that Taiwan continues to maintain its democratic system, its freedom of press, its civil society. And, I guess what the Japanese are thinking is that they want to prevent another Hong Kong from occurring, where the national security law that was adopted in June 2020 decimated civil society, decimated freedom of press, and decimated the voices of Hong Kong citizens. They want to avoid that, and I think their preferred approach is to really strengthen communication, strengthen people-to-people relations, strengthen party-to-party relations so that they can ensure that doesn't happen.
Japan still significantly trades with China, and those in the government, as you mentioned earlier, are treading a thin line of what they perceive as not crossing Beijing's red line. Are party-to-party talks, aside from talks, what substantial support do you see for Taiwan?
What we're seeing is that Japan, working with other like-minded countries, are really using their diplomatic power and voice to really raise the profile of Taiwan, raise the stakes of it. What happens to Taiwan matters not only to the region but to the world.
Such as with the WTO and all that. Yeah.
The WTO, but also
World
talking
Health
about,
Organization.
World Health Organization, but its place in the semiconductor supply chain, its place within a family of democratic political institutions within the region, its role in terms of fighting disinformation from China, its role in terms of fighting propaganda. There's a real strong sense that Taiwan needs to be pulled into global prominence, so there's a much better understanding of the importance that Taiwan really holds for democracy, for pushing it back against authoritarianism, for our technological supply chains. And again, we're seeing this in unilateral statements, bilateral statements, multilateral statements. And I think that this is really, really a positive step for Taiwan. What it means is, again, the status quo is preserved. And I think for ordinary Taiwanese people, what's most important is that they maintain their current life, their current political system, the current freedom of press, the current ability to have free civil society. This is a de facto sovereignty or de facto independence that needs to be preserved.
We've also seen earlier this year a trial ferry sail between Yilan and Yonaguni, which is only 110 kilometers apart. What many seem to misunderstand is Taiwan's closest neighbor is China, which is 170 kilometers, where in fact Japan is closer to Taiwan in that sense. What can we read from this geographic significance?
Yonaguni Islands are, you can see Taiwan from them. I think this is one of the reasons why Japan is so concerned about what happens to Taiwan, because their territory is so closely located to Taiwan. But I think, again, it's more about the long-term relationship that Japan has had with the beautiful island, Formosa, of Taiwan. And of course, they had its colonial history, but colonial history and its post-World War II history and the relationship that Japan and Taiwan has built together over the past 70 or 80 years is one of friendship, one of trade, one of a shared culture, one of mutual admiration, one that's built on shared understandings of democracy, rule of law, freedom of press, civil society. And, what it says is that these two societies really share a lot in common, and that these commonalities bring them together. And that if something happens to one or the other, that there's concerns that it could spill over into their states. And this is where I think why the two countries are converged at so many different levels.
Last but not least, given all these challenges, but also there's a boost in support for Taiwan, how do you feel Taiwan should navigate these challenges? And as you mentioned, making sure that democracy and our way of life here remains the way that it is.
I think it's really critical for us to, learn from what's happened to Hong Kong. As I mentioned, freedom of press has been crushed. Civil society has been crushed. Now young people are exposed to nationalist education in which that they are taught a very different reality than I think much of the world faces. No longer can the Tiananmen Square massacre events be commemorated in Hong Kong. And growingly, voices of dissent are quashed through the national security law. We definitely don't want this to happen to Taiwan. We want Taiwan to preserve its system, preserve its autonomy, preserve its lifestyle. And the best way to do that, again, is to find ways to build non-state relations with countries like Japan, like Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, increase the education exchanges, increase the business exchanges, increase the engagement between labor unions or fishery associations or other organizations to build a whole series of relationships that really tie Taiwan into many countries' interests. And I think that this is the way to move forward. Taiwan's done really well.
Thank you so much, Professor, and thank you all for joining us on Global Voices on Taiwan. To ensure you don't miss out exciting insights from this island nation's captivating stories, make sure to subscribe on your preferred podcast and social media platform.
Also, check our full video out on YouTube. See you soon.